The last thing my son said before he slammed the front door was, "You've been holding me back my entire life, Mom." I stood in his kitchen with the casserole dish still warm in my hands while my 11-year-old granddaughter cried quietly in the hallway. My daughter-in-law looked away, and my son, the boy I had raised alone after his father died, acted as if I were a burden he could finally throw away.
I don't understand. What are you telling me?
So I left. 3 months later, Ethan called me in the middle of the night, sobbing so hard, I barely recognized his voice. "Mom," he said, "she's gone." And in that terrible moment, my son finally realized that the only person who had ever loved him without conditions was the person he had already lost. Before I tell you what happened, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If this story touches your heart, please leave a comment and tell me how you would have responded in my place. And if you enjoy stories about family forgiveness and second chances, I hope you'll like and subscribe so we can share this journey together. My name is Valeria Cruz, and I was 62 years old the day my son told me I had been holding him back. But to understand why those words nearly destroyed me, you first need to understand who I was before I became someone's burden. I was born in Tucson, Arizona, the daughter of hardworking Mexican immigrants who taught me that family came before everything else. My father repaired air conditioners under the desert sun, and my mother cleaned hotel rooms until arthritis twisted her hands. We never had much money, but we had dinner together every night, and no one ever went to bed feeling unloved. At 23, I met Daniel Cruz. Daniel had a laugh that filled every room and a way of making ordinary days feel important. He worked as an electrician, and I was a school nurse. We bought a tiny house outside Phoenix with faded blue shutters and a lemon tree in the backyard. We dreamed about having several children. Life, however, had other plans. After years of trying, we had only one child, Ethan. The moment I held him, I believed God had finally answered every prayer I had ever whispered. Daniel cried in the delivery room. He kissed Ethan's tiny forehead and promised him that he would never have to face the world alone. For a while, that promise seemed possible. Ethan was a gentle child. He followed his father everywhere carrying toy tools while Daniel repaired things around the house. Every Saturday morning, they made pancakes together. Every Sunday afternoon, they played baseball in the backyard. And every night, Daniel tucked him into bed. When Ethan was 14, everything changed. Daniel was driving home from a job site when a drunk driver crossed the center line. The police knocked on my door at 6 in the evening. I still remember Ethan standing beside me in the kitchen when the officer removed his hat. I remember my son's face. He looked like a child who had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. After the funeral, Ethan stopped speaking for nearly 2 weeks. He stayed in his room. He stopped playing baseball. He stopped smiling. And I made a promise to myself standing beside my husband's grave. I would never allow my son to feel abandoned. I worked longer hours at the elementary school. During summers, I took extra shifts at a medical clinic. I sold Daniel's pickup truck. I canceled vacations. I emptied our savings account so Ethan could attend a good college. There were nights when I came home so exhausted that my feet bled from standing all day, but I still cooked dinner and sat beside him while he studied. Sometimes he would look at me and say, "Mom, you don't have to do all this." And I always answered the same way. "You're all I have." Maybe that was my first mistake. When Ethan graduated from Arizona State University, I cried harder than I had at his birth. He walked across that stage wearing his cap and gown, and I saw Daniel in his eyes. He hugged me afterward. "We did it, Mom." Not I did it, we. Those words stayed with me for years. Ethan found work in real estate. He was charming, handsome, and ambitious. People trusted him immediately. He sold homes quickly and began earning more money than I ever had. I was proud. Proud in the way only a mother can be. Every promotion felt like my own victory. Every success healed a small piece of the grief Daniel left behind. Then Ethan met Madison Carter. She was beautiful, polished, and confident. She came from a wealthy family in Scottsdale and carried herself as though she had never worried about money a day in her life. The first time I met her, she brought expensive wine to dinner and complimented my cooking. She was polite. Almost too polite. When Ethan proposed to her, I genuinely felt happy. I helped pay for the wedding. I used part of my retirement savings because Ethan said weddings were expensive, and I wanted him to start his new life without debt. "Mom, you don't have to do that," he said, but I insisted, because mothers insist. At the wedding reception, Ethan danced with me. He whispered, "Dad would be proud of us." Again, he said us. Again, I believed our bond could never break. After the wedding, things changed slowly, so slowly that I didn't notice at first. Ethan called less often. He canceled Sunday dinners. Birthdays became rushed phone calls. Sometimes weeks passed without seeing him. When I asked if everything was okay, he smiled and said he was simply busy, and perhaps he was. Life changes. Children grow up. Mothers learn to step aside. Then Sophie was born. The day my granddaughter entered the world, something inside me came alive again. She had Ethan's eyes and Daniel's smile. When I held her for the first time, I felt as though part of my husband had somehow returned to me. I promised myself that I would always be there for her. At first, Ethan seemed grateful. He brought Sophie to visit. He asked for advice. He still called me Mom with warmth in his voice, but there were moments, small moments, that began to trouble me. Madison would make comments. "We really need Ethan focused on his career. Ethan worries about you too much. We're trying to build our own life." She always smiled when she said these things, always gently, always politely. But I began to feel like a guest in my son's life. One afternoon, Sophie was 4 years old when she climbed into my lap and asked, "Grandma, why does Mommy get upset when Daddy visits you?" The question startled me. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" She shrugged. "Mommy says Daddy feels guilty all the time." I laughed it off. Children misunderstand things. At least, that's what I told myself. But that night, I sat alone at my kitchen table and stared at Daniel's photograph. For the first time, I wondered whether my son was slowly moving away from me. Not because he no longer loved me, but because someone was teaching him that love itself was a burden. I never imagined that one day Ethan would look directly at me and tell me I had held him back his entire life. And I certainly never imagined that the person who would pay the highest price for those words would be the little girl who loved him most. The first time Madison Carter walked into my home, she carried a bottle of expensive wine and wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She kissed my cheek, complimented my cooking, and called me Mrs. Cruz at least 6 times before dinner ended. Everyone adored her, especially Ethan. I remember watching him across the table smiling at her the way Daniel once smiled at me. His entire face changed whenever she spoke. He laughed more. He stood taller. He looked happy. And after losing his father so young, I wanted happiness for him more than I wanted anything for myself. "She's wonderful, Mom," he told me after their 3rd date. I smiled. I can see that. The truth was that Madison frightened me a little. Not because she was cruel, not because she was rude, but because she belonged to a world that neither Ethan nor I understood. Her parents owned several businesses in Scottsdale. Her father drove luxury cars. Her mother hosted charity events and country club dinners. They traveled constantly and spoke about investments the way ordinary people talked about the weather. At dinner one evening, her mother asked me where I had attended college. "I became a nurse after community college," I answered. She smiled politely. How admirable. I couldn't explain why that single word made me feel small. Still, Ethan loved Madison, and love makes mothers overlook many things. Their wedding took place at an expensive resort outside Phoenix. I paid for more than I could afford because Ethan kept saying everything had become so expensive. I withdrew money from my retirement account. I sold several pieces of jewelry Daniel had bought me. I never told Ethan. I didn't want him to feel guilty. On the night of the wedding, he held my hands while music played softly in the ballroom. "Thank you for everything, Mom." I touched his face. "Just be happy." For a while he was. The first year of their marriage seemed normal. Ethan's career was growing. Madison worked in marketing, and they bought a beautiful house in Chandler. I visited often. Sometimes I cooked dinner. Sometimes I watered plants when they traveled. Sometimes I simply sat on their patio and listened to Ethan talk about work. But slowly, almost invisibly, something began to change. It started with little comments. Madison would laugh and say, "Ethan worries about you too much." Or she would say, "You know, married couples need space." Once while I was washing dishes after dinner, she stood beside me and said quietly, "You're lucky Ethan is such a devoted son." I smiled. "I raised him that way." Her smile faded slightly. "Sometimes men stay attached longer than they should." I pretended not to understand, but I did. Several months later, Ethan canceled our Sunday lunch. Then another. Then another. When I called, he often sounded distracted. "Work's crazy, Mom. Maybe next weekend." Madison and I already made plans. At first, I accepted it. People build their own families. Parents must learn to let go. But whenever Ethan did visit, Madison seemed irritated if our conversations lasted too long. If I mentioned Daniel, she changed the subject. If Ethan and I laughed about old memories, she looked at her phone. And when Sophie was born, everything became more complicated. The moment I saw my granddaughter, my heart belonged to her. She had thick, dark hair, like Ethan's, and warm brown eyes that reminded me of Daniel. When I held her in the hospital, she wrapped her tiny fingers around mine. "I love her already," I whispered. Ethan smiled. "She already loves you, Mom." During Sophie's first years, I became a regular part of their lives. Madison returned to work. Ethan's career demanded long hours, and I gladly helped. I babysat, I cooked meals, I attended school events. I picked Sophie up whenever either parent worked late. I never asked for money. I never kept track of hours. Because that's what grandmothers do. Or at least, that's what I believed. One afternoon, Sophie was coloring pictures at my kitchen table. She looked up and asked, "Grandma, why doesn't Mommy like it when Daddy comes here?" The question caught me off guard. "What makes you think that?" "Because Mommy says Daddy feels responsible for you." I forced a smile. "Your mommy is probably just tired." But after Sophie left that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Responsible. The following month, Ethan stopped by alone. He looked exhausted. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. "Everything okay?" I asked. He sighed. "Madison thinks I spend too much time worrying about everybody." I sat across from him. "Everybody?" He rubbed his forehead. "You, Sophie, work, everything." I waited. He didn't continue. After several moments, he stood up. "I should go." As he walked toward the door, I said softly, "Are you happy, Ethan?" He stopped. For a few seconds, he didn't answer. Then he smiled. "I'm fine, Mom." Fine. The most dangerous word in the English language. Months passed. Madison became increasingly focused on appearances. She wanted a larger house, more expensive vacations, private schools, luxury cars. Ethan worked longer hours trying to provide those things. He became tired, impatient, distracted. One evening, I brought homemade enchiladas to their house. Madison opened the door. "Oh, you should have called. I thought I'd surprise everyone." She glanced toward the kitchen. "We already ordered food." I held the dish awkwardly. "Oh," she folded her arms. "You know sometimes Ethan feels guilty saying no to you." I stared at her. "Guilty?" She nodded. "He worries that you'll be lonely." I tried to speak. No words came. At that moment, Sophie ran down the hallway. "Grandma!" She hugged my legs. Behind her, Ethan appeared. He looked surprised to see me. For just 1 second, I saw something unfamiliar in his eyes. Not joy. Not warmth. Fatigue. As if my presence had become another responsibility he had to manage. That night, driving home alone, I cried for the first time in years. Not because anyone had been openly cruel. Because nobody had. The damage was happening quietly. Like water slowly cracking stone. Madison never insulted me directly. She simply planted small ideas. That Ethan worried too much. That he felt responsible. That he deserved freedom. And slowly, the son who once said, "We did it," was beginning to believe that his mother had become a weight he carried instead of the woman who had carried him. The worst part was that I could feel him drifting away. But I still believed love would bring him back. I still believed that the boy Daniel and I had raised was somewhere inside the man he had become. I didn't realize that someone was teaching him to see sacrifice as control, love as obligation, and his mother as the reason his life had not become everything he wanted. By then, the distance between us had already started growing. And neither of us understood how much damage that distance would eventually cause. By the time Sophie turned 6, I had become something between a grandmother, a housekeeper, a babysitter, and an emergency savings account. And somehow, I convinced myself that this was love. Every weekday morning, I drove 20 minutes to Ethan and Madison's house before sunrise. Ethan often left early for work, and Madison had recently accepted a management position that required longer hours. Sophie would run into my arms wearing her pajamas. "Grandma." Those moments made every sacrifice worthwhile. I packed her lunch. I braided her hair. I walked her to school. After school, she came back to my house where we baked cookies, watered my garden, and read books together until one of her parents arrived. Sometimes, Ethan came. Most nights, it was me driving Sophie home. At first, both Ethan and Madison thanked me, but gratitude slowly disappeared. What had once been a favor became an expectation. One Tuesday afternoon, Madison called. "Can you pick Sophie up today?" "Of course." Then another call. "Can you keep her until 9? Another. "Can you watch her Saturday? And eventually, we'll drop her off at 8. No request, no apology, no thank you, just information." One evening, after keeping Sophie for nearly 14 hours, I drove her home exhausted. My knees hurt from chasing her at the park, and my back ached from carrying groceries. Madison opened the front door. "Oh, good, she's already asleep." I smiled. She had a busy day. Madison glanced toward the kitchen. "Did she finish her homework?" "Yes." "And her reading assignment?" "Yes." "Great." That was all. No thank you, no acknowledgement. She turned and walked away. I stood there for several seconds before quietly leaving. The drive home felt unusually lonely. Daniel had once told me that people become accustomed to miracles if they happen every day. Perhaps I had become one of those invisible miracles. A few months later, Ethan called me. His voice sounded tense. "Mom, Can I borrow some money? How much? 5,000. My heart skipped. Is everything okay? Just temporary cash flow issues. I didn't ask questions. I had some retirement savings left. Money Daniel and I had planned to use for traveling one day. I transferred the money. 2 weeks later, Madison posted photographs from a weekend resort trip. I stared at the pictures. The hotel looked expensive. The wine looked expensive. Everything looked expensive. For the first time, I wondered where my money had gone. But when Ethan called that Sunday, I said nothing. Because mothers often protect their children from shame, even when the shame belongs to the child. One afternoon, Sophie sat beside me while we baked cinnamon bread. Grandma. Yes, sweetheart. Daddy and Mommy fight about money. I carefully stirred the batter. What makes you say that? Daddy says he's tired. She lowered her voice. Mommy says he worries too much about everyone. The same sentence again. Everyone, I asked softly. Does Daddy seem unhappy? Sophie nodded. He doesn't laugh anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I remembered the boy who once played baseball in our backyard. The young man who cried at his father's funeral. The son who hugged me at graduation. Where had he gone? Or perhaps a more frightening question. Had I made him believe that love meant sacrifice so completely that he no longer knew how to set boundaries? Maybe Madison wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe Ethan did feel responsible for me. Maybe he carried guilt. But I had never asked him to. I never asked him for money. I never demanded his time. I never expected him to care for me. Everything I had done for him had been freely given. At least, I believed it had. The following winter, I slipped while carrying groceries into my house. I injured my wrist badly enough that the doctor ordered me to wear a brace. I called Ethan. I had a little accident. When? This morning, his voice became concerned. Are you okay? I'm fine. Why didn't you call sooner? I hesitated. Because you always seem busy. Because I don't want to be a burden. Because your wife looks uncomfortable every time my name appears on your phone. But I said none of those things. I didn't want to interrupt your day. He sighed. I'll stop by this weekend. He never came. Work had become busy. A client needed attention. Madison had plans. Life happened. The next weekend, Sophie arrived with a handmade card. Inside, she had drawn our family. There was me. There was Ethan. There was Madison. There was Sophie. And surprisingly, there was Daniel. I smiled. Why did you draw Grandpa? She looked at me seriously. Because you're always talking to him. I laughed softly. Do you think he listens? She nodded. He probably misses Daddy. The words struck me. Not Ethan missing Daniel. Daniel missing Ethan. I suddenly wondered what my husband would think if he could see us now. His son exhausted. His granddaughter lonely. His wife slowly disappearing into the background. One Sunday, Ethan finally came to my house alone. He looked thinner, more tired. His expensive suit hung loosely on his shoulders. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then I asked quietly, Are you happy? Again. The same question. This time he didn't answer immediately. He stared into his coffee. I don't know. I waited. I just thought life would be different. What do you mean? He rubbed his forehead. I work constantly. We're always trying to get ahead. Every time we reach something, it isn't enough. I wanted to tell him that enough is a decision, not a number. But he continued. Sometimes I feel responsible for everyone. There it was again. responsible? I asked softly. Do you feel responsible for me? He looked surprised. No, of course not. But he didn't sound certain, and that frightened me more than any answer. Before leaving, he hugged me. The hug felt brief, polite, almost distant. As he reached the door, he said, "You know I love you, right?" I smiled. Of course. But after he left, I sat alone in my kitchen and cried. Not because he didn't love me, because I could feel him slowly changing into someone who measured love in obligations, someone who saw sacrifice as pressure, someone who no longer understood that I had never wanted anything from him except his happiness. Meanwhile, Sophie remained the brightest part of my life. She called me every evening. She showed me school drawings. She asked me about Grandpa Daniel. She still held my hand in public. Sometimes she would say, "Grandma, when I grow up, I want to live next door to you." I would smile. Your father used to say that too. The truth was that Sophie had become the emotional center of our family. Without her laughter, the house felt heavy. Without her kindness, the tension between her parents became impossible to ignore. And although I didn't realize it yet, she would one day become the person who loved Ethan more than anyone else ever could. The tragedy was that he couldn't see it. Not yet. He was too busy trying to build a life that kept moving farther away from the people who truly loved him. And I was still trying to save a son who no longer believed he needed saving. The night my son told me I was holding him back began like dozens of family dinners before it. I made enchiladas. Sophie helped me bake cookies. I brought fresh flowers from my garden because Madison liked white lilies, even though she had never once asked where they came from. The dinner had been Ethan's idea. "We should all eat together Friday," he told me over the phone. His voice sounded tired. I thought perhaps things were getting better. I should have known better. When I arrived, the house felt strangely quiet. Madison was sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone. Ethan stood beside the coffee maker, staring out the window. Sophie ran toward me immediately. "Grandma!" She wrapped her arms around my waist. I kissed her forehead. "How was school?" She smiled. "I got an A on my science project." "That's wonderful." Madison barely looked up. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Something in her voice felt cold. The meal itself was uncomfortable from the beginning. Ethan hardly spoke. Madison discussed rising interest rates, private schools, and a new neighborhood where she wanted to buy a larger house. The numbers she mentioned made my head spin. Finally, I asked gently, "Are you thinking about moving?" Madison exchanged a glance with Ethan. "We've talked about it." I smiled. "Well, wherever you go, Sophie will make it feel like home." Sophie grinned. "I want Grandma to live next door." The table became quiet. Madison set down her fork. "That probably isn't realistic." Sophie frowned. "Why not?" "Because adults need their own lives." I quickly changed the subject, but something had already shifted. After dinner, I stood in the kitchen washing dishes. It was a habit. Nobody had asked me. Nobody ever needed to. I heard voices in the dining room. At first, I wasn't listening. Then I heard my name. Madison spoke quietly. "We can't keep doing this." Ethan sighed. "I know. You always feel guilty." "I'm trying." "You're 40 years old, Ethan." My hands stopped moving. Water ran over the dishes. My heart began beating faster. Several moments later, Ethan entered the kitchen. His face looked exhausted. "Mom, can we sit down for a minute?" Something inside me immediately became afraid. We sat at the dining room table. Madison remained beside him. Sophie was upstairs. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Ethan rubbed his hands together. "There's something we need to talk about." I smiled nervously. "Okay." He avoided my eyes. "Things have been difficult lately." I nodded. I know work has been stressful. It's more than work. Madison folded her arms. Ethan carries too much responsibility. I looked at my son. What kind of responsibility? He inhaled deeply, and then he said the words that would replay in my mind for months afterward. Mom, you've been holding me back. The room became silent. I honestly thought I had misunderstood. What? He finally looked at me. I've spent my entire life worrying about you. I stared at him. Worrying about me. You've always depended on me emotionally. My mouth opened. No sound came out. Madison ate quietly beside him, not interrupting, not helping, simply watching. I shook my head. Ethan, I don't understand. He stood up and began pacing. Ever since Dad died, everything became about taking care of you. My chest tightened. I was taking care of you. He looked frustrated. Exactly. You made me feel responsible for your happiness. I couldn't breathe. I never asked you for that. You didn't have to. The words hit me harder than any insult ever could. All the years, the double shifts, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the money, the worry, the love, suddenly they had become evidence against me. Madison spoke softly. Nobody is saying you're a bad mother. I looked at her. Then what are you saying? She answered calmly. Ethan deserves to live his own life. I turned back toward my son. Have I stopped you from doing that? His voice rose. You always need something. I felt completely stunned. What do I need? You call? I call because you're my son. You expect me to visit. You're my son. You make me feel guilty when I don't. Tears filled my eyes. I have never once asked you for money. I know. I never asked you to take care of me. I know. I never asked you to sacrifice your life. He looked away, but then he said the sentence that shattered my heart. I've spent my entire life trying to make sure you weren't alone. I stared at him, slowly, quietly. Ethan? My voice trembled. I was alone because your father died. Nobody spoke. I worked 2 jobs because your father died. Tears rolled down my face. I gave up everything because your father died. My voice broke. And I did it so you wouldn't be alone. Ethan looked uncomfortable. Madison looked impatient, as if this conversation had gone on too long. Finally, she said, No one is blaming you. I turned toward her. Then why do I feel blamed? Ethan sat down again. His voice became quieter. I just think we need boundaries. What kind of boundaries? He hesitated. I think maybe we need some space. The word space, people use it because it sounds kinder than rejection. I nodded slowly. How much space? Madison answered. Maybe fewer visits. Ethan added quietly. And maybe call first. I felt my hands shaking. Sophie suddenly appeared at the top of the stairs. What's happening? Nobody answered. She walked down slowly. Her eyes moved from her father to me. Grandma? I forced a smile. Everything's okay? She didn't believe me. Children always know. Ethan spoke carefully. We're just talking. Sophie moved beside my chair. She took my hand, and somehow that simple gesture made everything hurt even more. Because the only person trying to protect me in that room was an 11-year-old girl. I stood up. very carefully, very slowly. "I think I should go home." Sophie immediately looked frightened. "Grandma, no." I kissed her forehead. "I'll see you soon." Ethan finally stood. "Mom." I looked directly at him, for the first time all evening. "Did you really mean it?" His face tightened. "What?" "That I've held you back your entire life." He didn't answer immediately. That silence gave me my answer. I picked up my purse. The casserole dish still sat untouched on the kitchen counter. The flowers remained where I had placed them. Everything I had brought to that house suddenly felt foolish. At the front door, Sophie hugged me tightly. Her voice trembled. "Grandma, don't be sad." I kissed her hair. "I'm okay." But I wasn't. As I stepped outside, Ethan followed me. The porch light cast shadows across his face. He looked tired, almost guilty. "Mom, I didn't mean—" I interrupted him. "No, Ethan." My voice was calm. Too calm. "I think you meant every word." His eyes filled with uncertainty. I climbed into my car. He stood in the driveway. For a moment, I almost rolled down the window, almost told him I forgave him, almost apologized for things I had never done. Instead, I drove away. In my rearview mirror, I saw Sophie standing beside her father. She was crying. And although I did not know it then, that would be the last normal evening our family would ever have. Because after that night, I decided to give my son exactly what he wanted: space. And neither of us understood how expensive that space would become. The morning after Ethan told me I had been holding him back, I woke up before sunrise. For the first few seconds, I forgot. Then I opened my eyes and remembered every word. The house was silent. No missed calls, no text messages, no apology. I made coffee and sat alone at my kitchen table staring at Daniel's photograph. For 30 years, whenever life became difficult, I had talked to my husband. That morning, I whispered, "What do I do now?" Of course he didn't answer. But as sunlight slowly entered the room, I realized something painful. I had spent most of my adult life taking care of someone. First my parents, then Daniel, then Ethan, then Sophie. I didn't know who Valeria Cruz was when nobody needed her. That frightened me. Around 8 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Madison. I stared at the screen. For several seconds, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. "Hello?" Her voice sounded perfectly normal. "Good morning, Valeria. I wanted to see if you could watch Sophie tomorrow evening." I sat silently. She continued. "We have a dinner event." I waited. No mention of the night before. No apology. No discussion. As if my son had not just told me I had ruined his life. Finally, I said quietly, "I can't." She seemed surprised. "Oh. I have plans." There was a long silence. "What plans?" The question startled me. I honestly didn't know. I had not had plans for myself in years, but I answered anyway. "I'll be busy." When I hung up, my hands were trembling. Not because I felt guilty, because I had just said no for the first time. 2 days later, Ethan called. "Mom, can you pick Sophie up from school Friday?" Normally, I would have answered immediately. This time, I took a breath. "No, Ethan." Silence. "What do you mean? I won't be able to." His voice changed. "You always pick her up." I looked around my empty kitchen. Yes, I always had. "I think you'll need to make other arrangements." He sounded frustrated. "Mom, we're both working." I nearly laughed. For 30 years, so had I. But instead I said calmly, I understand. The conversation ended quickly. When I hung up, I cried. Not because I regretted my decision, because setting boundaries felt like grieving. Every act of independence felt like another small funeral. The following Monday, I drove to the community center 3 miles from my house. I had passed the building hundreds of times. Inside, women my age attended art classes, exercise groups, book clubs, and volunteer programs. For years, I told myself I was too busy. The truth was simpler. I had built my entire identity around being needed. A woman named Patricia introduced herself. She was 68, widowed, and had silver hair cut short around her face. First time? She asked. I nodded. She smiled warmly. You're going to survive. I laughed. Is it that obvious? She looked at me carefully. You look like someone who spent years taking care of everyone else. My eyes filled unexpectedly. How can you tell? Because I used to look exactly the same. Over the next several weeks, I began attending twice a week. I joined a gardening group. I started walking in the mornings. I read books again. I baked for neighbors. For the first time in years, entire days passed without my phone ringing. At first, that hurt. Then it became peaceful. Meanwhile, Ethan's calls became increasingly practical. Can you watch Sophie Saturday? No. Can you loan me your SUV? No. Can you come by for a few hours? No. Every refusal felt strange. I was not angry. I was simply respecting the boundary he had requested. Space. One evening, my phone rang unexpectedly. It was Sophie. Grandma. Her voice sounded small. Hi, sweetheart. Why don't you come over anymore? My heart broke. I chose my words carefully. Your daddy asked for some space. She became quiet. I miss you. I miss you too. Mommy says you're busy. I looked around my living room. I had been sitting alone for 2 hours. Sometimes grown-ups need time to think. She whispered, Daddy is angry all the time. I closed my eyes. What happened? He and Mommy fight. My chest tightened. What do they fight about? I don't know. Children always know more than adults think, but they often don't have the words. Before hanging up, Sophie said, Can I still love you? Tears rolled down my cheeks. Oh, sweetheart, you never have to ask that. Several days later, I went grocery shopping. As I walked through the produce section, I heard someone call my name. Valeria. I turned. It was Linda, a former co-worker from the elementary school. She smiled. You look different. I laughed. Older? No. She studied me. Lighter. The word stayed with me. Lighter. Perhaps because I had spent years carrying responsibilities that no longer belonged to me. That evening, I found an old box of photographs. There was Daniel. There was Ethan at 6 years old. Ethan playing baseball. Ethan graduating. Ethan dancing at his wedding. I realized something painful. Every photograph showed me standing beside him, protecting him, supporting him, encouraging him, never once asking for anything. Yet somehow, my love had become a burden in his mind. Perhaps because people sometimes rewrite history to justify their decisions. Several weeks passed. Then one Saturday afternoon, I saw Ethan unexpectedly. I was leaving the community center when his car pulled into the parking lot. He stepped out. He looked tired, more tired than before. Mom. Hello? His eyes moved toward the building. What are you doing here? I volunteer twice a week. He seemed surprised. I didn't know that. There are many things you don't know anymore. The words came out more sharply than I intended. He looked uncomfortable. I've been busy? I nodded. Yes. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked, Are you okay? It was strange hearing the question, after all these years. I am. He looked uncertain. I just haven't seen you. You asked for space. His face tightened. I didn't mean this much space. I almost smiled. How much space did you mean, Ethan? He had no answer, because people often ask for distance without understanding what distance truly feels like. He looked older standing there. Not old, just tired. For a brief moment, I wanted to hug him, tell him everything would be okay, rescue him, the way mothers always do. Instead, I simply said, Take care of yourself. As I walked toward my car, he called after me. Sophie misses you. I stopped. My heart immediately softened. I miss her too. Maybe you could come by. I turned. Does Madison want me there? He looked away, and that silence answered the question. That evening, I sat outside beneath the Arizona sunset. The sky turned orange and purple above my backyard. For the first time in many years, I felt something unfamiliar. Not happiness, not sadness. Freedom. Painful freedom. The kind that comes after losing something you thought would always belong to you. I still loved my son. Nothing could change that. But I was beginning to understand that loving someone does not mean allowing them to hurt you. And somewhere inside Ethan's house, the consequences of our separation were already beginning to grow. He simply could not see them yet. Neither could I. But the first cracks in his perfect life had already started to appear. And soon, all of us would feel them. The first sign that something was wrong came from Sophie. Not Ethan, not Madison. Sophie. She called me on a Tuesday evening while I was watering the roses in my backyard. Grandma. Her voice sounded unusually quiet. Hi, sweetheart. Are you busy? I set the watering can aside. Never too busy for you. She hesitated. Mom and Dad are fighting again. I felt my stomach tighten. What happened? I don't know. Children always say they don't know, but they hear everything. I sat down on the patio chair. Are they yelling? A little? I closed my eyes. Where are you? In my room. Okay, stay there for now. She was silent for several seconds. Then she whispered, I miss when you came over. Those words stayed with me long after we hung up. For years, I had believed that stepping away from Ethan's life would only affect him and me. I never imagined that Sophie would become caught between us. 3 days later, Ethan called. His voice sounded tense. Mom, do you have a minute? Of course. He sighed heavily. Things have been difficult. I waited. I've had 2 sales fall through. I'm sorry. The market's slowing down. I listened quietly. Part of me wanted to say, I warned you not to spend so much. Another part wanted to drive to his house immediately. Instead, I remained still. He continued. Madison is upset. About the money. About everything. There was a long silence. Then he asked, Would you be willing to watch Sophie this weekend? The old Valeria would have said yes before he finished the sentence. But now I heard something else beneath his words. Not reconciliation, not apology, need. I already have plans. What plans? I smiled sadly. You never used to ask. He sounded frustrated. Mom, this isn't easy. I looked toward Daniel's photograph sitting beside my chair. No, Ethan, it isn't. The conversation ended awkwardly. Afterward, I cried. Not because I refused him, because I still wanted to help. That was the hardest part. Loving someone who had hurt you. Wanting to rescue someone who had pushed you away. Meanwhile, Ethan's home was beginning to change. I learned most of it from Sophie. Mommy is angry all the time. What about your dad? He works. Does he seem okay? She thought for a moment. He looks tired. One Saturday afternoon, Sophie appeared unexpectedly at my front door. Madison stood beside her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Madison forced a smile. We have an appointment. I looked surprised. Oh, Sophie wanted to see you. The little girl immediately ran into my arms. I held her tightly. Madison glanced at her watch. We'll pick her up later. Before leaving, she hesitated. Then she asked, How have you been? The question felt strange, because she had never asked before. I'm doing well. She nodded. You seem happier. I wasn't sure whether it was a compliment or an accusation. After she left, Sophie helped me bake bread. She looked more serious than usual. Children change when homes become unhappy. Grandma. Yes. Can people stop loving each other? The question caught me completely off guard. I carefully set down the spoon. Why are you asking? She stared at the dough. My parents don't smile anymore. I moved beside her. Your mom and dad are having a hard time. Did Dad stop loving you? My chest tightened. No. Then why don't you come over? I struggled to answer. How do you explain adult pain to an 11-year-old? Finally, I said, Sometimes people become confused. She nodded slowly. Daddy seems confused. That night after Sophie went home, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. Daddy seems confused. Perhaps that was exactly right, because Ethan had spent his entire life trying to be everything for everyone. The perfect son, the perfect husband, the successful provider. And somewhere along the way, he stopped knowing who he actually was. A week later, I ran into Ethan at a grocery store. He looked terrible. His suit was wrinkled. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. He was buying frozen dinners. Ethan? He looked startled. Mom. For several seconds, we stood awkwardly beside the refrigerators. You look tired. He laughed softly. I am. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Instead, I asked one. How's Sophie? He smiled. She's okay. And Madison? His smile disappeared. We've been arguing. I'm sorry. He rubbed his forehead. Everything costs more. I said nothing. He looked around the store. I didn't realize how much you used to do. The words surprised me. I looked at him. What do you mean? He laughed bitterly. Sophie's school pickups. Meals, babysitting, emergencies. I waited. He continued. We're constantly rushing now. Part of me wanted to say, you wanted space. Instead, I simply nodded. As we stood there, his phone rang. Madison. He looked at the screen. His entire body became tense. You should answer. He sighed. Yeah. Before he walked away, he turned back. Sophie misses you. I miss her too. He hesitated. She talks about you all the time. After he left, I remained standing beside the frozen vegetables for several minutes, because for the first time, I realized something. My absence had created a vacuum inside their home. Not because I was essential, because love had been essential, and love had quietly disappeared. Several days later, Sophie called again. This time, she was crying. "Grandma, what happened? Mom and Dad are yelling." I stood immediately. "Are you safe?" "Yes." "What are they arguing about?" She sniffled. "Money." My heart sank. Then she whispered something that frightened me. "Mom said Dad cares more about everybody else than his own family." The exact accusation Madison had repeated for years. Only now it had turned toward Ethan. The very thing she once said about me. That evening, I sat alone outside while the Arizona sunset faded into darkness. I thought about my son. The little boy who once cried after his father's funeral. The young man who promised he would always take care of me. The husband trying desperately to satisfy a woman who never seemed satisfied. And I realized something painful. Ethan had spent years believing he was trapped because of me. But perhaps he had never actually been trapped. Perhaps he had simply been afraid. Afraid of disappointing people. Afraid of failing. Afraid of losing love. And now the very life he thought he wanted was beginning to collapse around him. The larger house Madison wanted suddenly seemed impossible. The expensive vacations stopped. The dinners became arguments. The marriage began cracking. And standing in the middle of all of it was an 11-year-old girl who still loved everyone, especially her father. Sophie still defended him, still hugged him, still waited for him to smile. She had no idea that one day she would become the only person left who truly saw the good inside him. But the truth was already approaching, slowly, quietly, and none of us were ready for it. The first time my chest hurt, I thought it was grief. Not grief over Daniel. Not even grief over Ethan. It was a different kind of pain. A quiet ache that settled beneath my ribs and spread into my shoulders whenever I climbed the stairs or carried groceries. I told myself it was age. At 62, people expect aches. People expect fatigue. People expect women like me to say, "I'm fine." So I did. One Thursday morning, while volunteering at the community garden, I became dizzy. Patricia immediately noticed. "You don't look good." "I'm fine." She folded her arms. "That's exactly what women say before they collapse." I laughed. She didn't. 20 minutes later, she drove me to my doctor. Dr. Leonard had treated me for nearly 15 years. He reviewed my tests quietly while I sat on the examination table. Finally, he removed his glasses. "Valeria, I want you to see a cardiologist." My stomach tightened. "Is it serious?" He hesitated. "I don't know yet." Those words frightened me more than certainty. The following week, I sat alone in a cardiology office while machines monitored my heart. The waiting room was filled with older couples, husbands holding hands, wives reading magazines, adult children accompanying parents. I sat by myself. For the first time in many years, loneliness felt physical. The cardiologist, Dr. Singh, spoke gently. "You have signs of a developing heart condition." I stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means we need additional testing." "Is it dangerous?" He chose his words carefully. "It can become serious if untreated." The room suddenly felt smaller. For several seconds, I thought only one thing. I should call Ethan. Then another thought arrived. "You're holding him back." The words echoed inside my mind. I imagined calling, telling him I needed help, watching his face tighten. hearing Madison's sigh in the background. I couldn't do it. So I drove home alone. That evening, I stood in my kitchen looking at my phone. Ethan's number sat at the top of my contacts. My thumb hovered over the screen. I remembered the night at his house, the accusation, the disappointment in his eyes, the exhaustion. Slowly, I set the phone down. Some mothers spend their entire lives trying not to become burdens. I had officially become one. A few days later, Sophie called. "Grandma." "Hi, sweetheart. You sound tired." I smiled. "Do I?" "A little. Children notice everything." "I'm okay." She became quiet. "Mom says Dad has been working late." "How are things at home?" She hesitated. "They fight a lot." "What about money?" I closed my eyes. She continued. "Mom says everything was easier before." Before. Such a dangerous word. Before what? Before the arguments? Before the stress? Or before the woman who had quietly held their family together stepped away? I never asked. Later that evening, my chest began hurting again. Not severe, just enough to frighten me. I sat in my living room, holding Daniel's photograph. "You always promised we'd grow old together," I whispered. Tears filled my eyes. I don't know how to do this alone. For years, I had been strong. Strong after Daniel died. Strong while raising Ethan. Strong during difficult jobs. Strong through loneliness. But sitting there that night, I finally admitted something. I was afraid. Not of dying, of becoming unwanted. The next week brought more tests. Stress tests. Blood work. Scans. Every appointment reminded me that time moves forward whether we are ready or not. One afternoon, Dr. Singh spoke plainly. "You need to reduce stress." I almost laughed. "Do you know any mothers?" He smiled. "I'm serious." "So am I." He leaned forward. "Who helps you?" I didn't answer, because I honestly didn't know. Years earlier, the answer would have been Daniel. Later, it would have been Ethan. Now, nobody. Patricia occasionally called. The women from the community center checked on me, but family had become complicated. A few days later, Ethan unexpectedly appeared at my front door. I had not told him anything. He simply arrived. He looked exhausted. His tie was loose. His face looked older. "Can I come in?" "Of course." I made coffee. We sat in silence. Finally, he said, "Sophie's worried about you." I looked surprised. "Why?" "She says you sound sad." Children again. Always seeing what adults ignore. I smiled softly. "I'm okay." He studied me. "You look tired." For one brief second, I almost told him. The doctor, the tests, the fear, the loneliness. But then I remembered his words. "You've been holding me back." So instead I said, "I'm getting older." He looked uncomfortable. "Mom, it's normal." He nodded. Neither of us knew how to speak honestly anymore. There were too many wounds sitting between us. Before leaving, he said something unexpected. "Sophie asks about you every day." I smiled. "I miss her." "You could visit?" The invitation surprised me. "Would Madison want that?" He looked away. "I don't know." There it was. The truth. He still didn't know. Not because he didn't care, because he was trying to keep peace everywhere and succeeding nowhere. After he left, I sat alone in my backyard. The Arizona air had begun cooling. Leaves moved gently in the evening breeze. For the first time, I seriously considered writing a will. The thought shocked me. Not because of death, because I realized how much remained unsaid. Would Ethan regret our distance? Would he understand why I stopped calling? Would he know I still loved him? Or would he simply remember me as the mother who held him back? Several days later, I experienced another episode. Dizziness, pain, shortness of breath. Patricia drove me home. She sat beside me at the kitchen table. "Have you told your son?" "No." "Why?" I looked toward the window. "He has enough problems." She stared at me. "No, Valeria, that's not why." I said nothing, because she was right. The real reason was much harder. I was afraid he wouldn't come. That fear sat inside me for days. Every time my phone rang, I hoped it was Ethan. Every time it wasn't, I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. One Saturday afternoon, Sophie called again. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Grandma?" "Hi, sweetheart." "I drew something for you." "What is it?" "It's our family." I smiled. "Who's in it?" "You, me, Daddy." "What about Mommy?" She became quiet. I forgot. The answer unsettled me. Children often reveal truths they don't fully understand. Then she said something that stayed with me. "Daddy looks sad all the time." My chest tightened. "Why do you think that?" "Because nobody hugs him anymore." Nobody hugs him anymore. The words echoed through my house long after the call ended. Because perhaps that was the tragedy beginning to unfold. Madison had stopped believing in him. He had pushed his mother away. His marriage was crumbling. His work was failing. And only one small girl still looked at him with complete love. Only Sophie still believed he was good. Only Sophie still saw the father behind the broken man. Neither Ethan nor I realized how important that love would become. And while my heart slowly weakened in silence, another heart, Sophie's, was becoming the last safe place my son had left. The first time Sophie came to see me without either of her parents, she arrived carrying a small pink backpack and a look on her face that no 11-year-old should ever wear. It was a Saturday morning. I had just returned from the farmer's market when my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Sophie stood there beside a neighbor from Ethan's neighborhood. "Grandma," she said quietly. My heart immediately tightened. "What happened?" The neighbor smiled apologetically. "I was heading this way, and Sophie asked if I could bring her. She said you wouldn't mind." "Of course not." As soon as the woman left, Sophie wrapped her arms around me. She held me much longer than usual. "Sweetheart." She shook her head. "I just wanted to come here." I didn't ask questions immediately. Children often tell the truth when they feel safe, and my house had always been Sophie's safe place. I made pancakes. She helped me cut strawberries. For a while, we pretended everything was normal. But children carry sadness differently than adults. Adults hide it. Children simply become quieter. After breakfast, she sat beside the lemon tree in my backyard, the same tree Daniel and I had planted 30 years earlier. I brought her a glass of lemonade. "Would you like to tell me what's wrong?" She stared down at her shoes. "Daddy sleeps on the couch now." My chest tightened. "How long?" "A few weeks." I sat beside her. "Do Mommy and Daddy know you came here?" She nodded. "Daddy does." "What did he say?" "He said it was okay." That surprised me, because Ethan had not called. He had not warned me. Perhaps he simply assumed Sophie needed me. Perhaps deep inside he knew it too. Sophie looked toward the house. Grandma? Yes. Why do people stop loving each other? I felt tears rise behind my eyes. Sometimes they don't stop loving. Sometimes they stop understanding each other. She nodded slowly. Daddy doesn't smile anymore. The sentence hurt, because I remembered the boy who smiled constantly, the teenager who laughed with Daniel, the young man who danced at his wedding. Somewhere along the way, my son had forgotten how. Later that afternoon, we baked cookies together. She told me about school, her friends, her teachers, and then suddenly she said, "Daddy cries sometimes." I stopped stirring. What do you mean? I heard him in the garage. I looked at her carefully. When? Last week? She lowered her voice. He thought nobody could hear. My heart broke, because Ethan had always hidden his pain. After Daniel died, he cried only once in front of me. The rest of his grief happened behind closed doors, just like now. That evening, Ethan finally called. Mom? His voice sounded tired. Sophie there? Yes? Silence. Then, thank you. I sat at my kitchen table. She's welcome here anytime. He exhaled heavily. I know. I wanted to ask how things were. I wanted to ask about Madison. I wanted to ask whether he was sleeping, eating, coping. Instead, I asked one question. Are you okay? He laughed softly. No. The honesty surprised me. Neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, I don't think I've been okay for a long time. My eyes filled with tears. For one brief moment, I heard the old Ethan, the boy who used to tell me everything. But then he added, I'll pick Sophie up later. And the wall returned. That evening, Sophie sat beside me on the couch. She held Daniel's old baseball glove. Was Grandpa nice? I smiled. He was the kindest man I've ever known. Was Daddy like him? I looked at the family photographs above the fireplace. Very much. She seemed relieved. Because Daddy doesn't feel nice anymore? The words hurt. Not because they were cruel. Because they were true. Ethan had become exhausted. And exhausted people sometimes stop looking like themselves. The following weeks, Sophie began visiting more often. Sometimes Ethan dropped her off. Sometimes Madison did. Occasionally, neither parent even came inside. Their marriage was becoming visible in small details. Missed conversations, separate arrivals, cold expressions. One afternoon, while Sophie painted at my dining room table, she asked, If Mom leaves, will Dad be alone? I looked at her. What makes you think Mom might leave? She shrugged. She packs bags sometimes. I suddenly understood. The arguments had gone much further than I realized. That evening after Ethan picked her up, I sat alone thinking. For months, I had focused entirely on my own pain, the rejection, the words, the distance. But perhaps Ethan was drowning. Perhaps he had been drowning for years, trying to satisfy Madison, trying to build the perfect life, trying to prove he was successful, trying to be enough. And every failure felt like evidence that someone had held him back. Someone. Anyone. Maybe even me. A few days later, Sophie called before bed. Grandma? Yes, sweetheart. If Daddy loses everything, will you still love him? The question stunned me. Why would you ask that? Because Mommy says people only stay when things are good. Tears filled my eyes, because Sophie already understood something the adults around her did not. Love is tested when life becomes difficult. And then she said the words that would stay with me forever. I'll always love Daddy. I closed my eyes. I know you will. He makes mistakes. Yes. He gets angry. Sometimes. But he's still my dad. My voice broke. Yes, sweetheart. At that moment, I realized something important. Sophie was the only person in Ethan's life who still loved him without conditions. Madison loved success. Clients loved results. Friends loved convenience. But Sophie loved him when he was tired, when he was angry, when he failed, when he forgot to smile. She still believed in him. She still saw goodness inside him. And perhaps that was why God gives children such extraordinary hearts. Because they love us before we earn it. One Sunday evening, Ethan arrived to pick Sophie up. He looked thinner. His wedding ring was still on his finger, but he kept turning it around unconsciously. Sophie hugged me tightly. Can I come back next week? Of course. She smiled. Then she ran to the car. Ethan remained beside the front door. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, She talks about you constantly. I smiled. I talk about her too. He nodded. Then very quietly he said, She's the only thing keeping me going right now. My heart stopped. Because he didn't realize what he had just admitted. He had lost his wife emotionally. He had lost his career confidence. He had pushed away his mother. And now, only an 11-year-old girl still held his heart together. Only Sophie still believed her father was worth saving. Neither of us knew then how fragile life truly was. Neither of us understood how precious her love would become. But as Ethan drove away that night, I watched the taillights disappear into the darkness and felt something I could not explain. Fear. Because for the first time I realized that the person holding my son together was not his wife. It wasn't his job. It wasn't his money. It wasn't even me. It was a little girl who still believed her father could become the man he used to be. And sometimes life takes away the very people we assume will always remain. The day Madison left began like any other Tuesday. The Arizona sun was already bright when I woke up. I made coffee, watered my flowers, and prepared myself for another doctor's appointment. At 10:30, my phone rang. It was Ethan. His voice sounded strange, not angry, not tired, empty. Mom? Yes. There was a long silence. Then he said quietly, Madison left. My hand tightened around the phone. What happened? Another silence. Can I come over? Of course. He arrived an hour later. For a moment, I barely recognized my son. His clothes were wrinkled. His beard had grown. His eyes looked red from lack of sleep. He sat at my kitchen table exactly where Daniel had once sat, exactly where Ethan had done homework as a teenager, and for several minutes neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked down at his hands. She packed 2 suitcases. I sat quietly. Did she say where she was going? Her sister's house? His voice cracked. She said she needed space. The irony nearly took my breath away. Space. The same word. The same distance. The same pain. I wanted to remind him. I wanted to say, You asked me for space too. But pain had already begun teaching him lessons that my words never could. What happened? I asked gently. He laughed bitterly. Everything. Over the previous 6 months, Ethan had lost 3 major clients. The housing market had slowed. Commissions became smaller. Bills continued growing. The larger house Madison wanted had become impossible. The private school applications were postponed. Vacation plans disappeared. Arguments replaced conversations. I thought things would improve. They didn't. He shook his head. Nothing was enough anymore. I listened. For the first time in years, my son was speaking honestly. No pretending, no successful businessman, no perfect husband. Just Ethan, broken. He rubbed his face. She said she's tired of struggling. I looked at him carefully. Are you struggling? He laughed softly. I think I've been struggling for years. The words stayed between us, because perhaps both of us knew that his problems had not started with money. Money simply exposed them. What about Sophie? His eyes filled. She's devastated. Where is she? School. He swallowed hard. I don't know how to tell her this is real. For the first time since our argument months earlier, I wanted to reach across the table and hold his hand. But something had changed inside me. Not love. Boundaries. I still loved my son. I simply understood now that loving him did not mean rescuing him from every pain. Before leaving, he stood near the door. Mom? Yes. I'm sorry. The words came quietly. Not enough to heal, but enough to matter. For what? He looked down. Everything. My eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. So I simply nodded. After he left, I sat alone, thinking about Daniel. My husband had always believed that people reveal themselves during difficult times. Success hides many truths. Failure exposes them. Several days later, Sophie came to stay with me for the weekend. She walked into my house carrying her backpack. Her smile seemed forced. Children often try to protect adults. How are you feeling? I asked. She shrugged. Okay. No 11-year-old answers that way unless they are hurting. That evening, we sat on the porch together. The sunset painted the sky orange. Sophie held a blanket around her shoulders. Mom says she needs time. I nodded. Sometimes adults do. Will she come back? I wanted to tell her yes. I wanted to protect her. But lies eventually become another kind of abandonment. I don't know. Tears appeared in her eyes. I don't want Daddy to be alone. My heart broke, because even now, Sophie's first concern was not herself. It was her father. The next morning, Ethan arrived to pick her up. He looked even more exhausted. Sophie immediately hugged him. I missed you. He held her tightly. I missed you too. For several seconds, neither moved. I watched quietly from the doorway. This was the version of Ethan I remembered. The father. The gentleman. The boy Daniel raised. As they prepared to leave, Sophie ran back toward me. She whispered, Daddy cried last night. I looked toward Ethan. He stood beside the car, staring at the ground. My son was finally falling apart, and strangely, that frightened me less than watching him pretend to be fine. Weeks passed. Madison rarely came home. She called Sophie. Occasionally she visited, but something had ended. Everyone could feel it. One evening, Ethan called unexpectedly. Can I ask you something? Of course. Did Dad ever feel like a failure? The question surprised me. Why? He laughed softly. Because I do. I looked at Daniel's photograph beside my bed. Your father felt afraid sometimes. He did? Yes. What did he do? He talked about it. Ethan became quiet. I don't know how. Neither did Daniel when he was young. Neither did most men. They carry pain until it becomes too heavy. Then they collapse beneath it. A week later, Sophie called. Daddy forgot dinner. What do you mean? He was sleeping. I frowned. Is he okay? I think so. Children notice these things. Exhaustion, depression, silence. I considered calling Ethan. Instead, I waited. That evening, my own chest pain returned. I sat quietly until it passed. For several moments, I wondered what would happen if something happened to me. Would Ethan know? Would he come? Would he regret the distance between us? Then I thought about Sophie. She still called every day. She still believed everyone could heal. She still loved her father without hesitation. One afternoon, while drawing at my kitchen table, she asked, Grandma? Yes. Why did Mommy leave? I chose my words carefully. Sometimes adults become disappointed. In people. Sometimes. She looked down at her drawing. Daddy isn't bad. My throat tightened. I know. He just gets sad. I nodded. Yes. She continued coloring. Then she said something that would stay with me forever. I'm not leaving him. Tears filled my eyes. Because this little girl had become her father's last source of unconditional love. Madison had left. His friends had become distant. His career was failing. He had pushed his mother away, and only Sophie still believed completely. Only Sophie still saw the man behind the mistakes. Only Sophie still waited for him to smile. One evening, Ethan came to my house after dropping Sophie at a friend's home. He sat quietly in my living room. Finally, he said, She deserved better parents. No. He looked up. She deserved happier ones. His eyes filled with tears. I don't know how I became this person. I wanted to tell him that people do not become lost overnight. They lose themselves one compromise at a time, one fear at a time, one disappointment at a time. But before I could speak, he whispered, Sophie's the only reason I get up in the morning. The words frightened me, because I suddenly understood something terrible. My son had placed all of his remaining hope inside an 11-year-old girl, and children were never meant to carry the weight of saving adults. As Ethan drove home that night, I stood in the doorway watching his car disappear. For the first time, I truly feared for him. Not because Madison had left, not because his career was failing, but because he had lost almost everyone, and he did not realize that the one person still holding him together was far more fragile than he could imagine. After Madison left, Ethan's house became quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of silence that settles into walls after too many arguments have been spoken. Sophie told me that her father no longer played music in the mornings. He stopped cooking breakfast. Sometimes he forgot to turn on the television. He just sits there, she said one afternoon while helping me fold laundry. Where? In the kitchen. What does he do? She shrugged. He looks outside. I knew that look. I had worn it myself after Daniel died. The look of someone whose life has changed faster than their heart can accept. For several weeks, Ethan continued working, but his real estate business was falling apart. The market had slowed, and several clients moved to other agents. The pressure kept growing. One evening, he called me. His voice sounded strange. "Mom?" "Yes." "Do you ever get tired?" The question surprised me. "Of what?" "Everything." I sat quietly, because there had been many nights after Daniel died when I had asked myself the same question. "Yes," I answered. "What do you do?" I looked at my hands. "You wake up the next morning." He laughed softly. "That sounds difficult." "It is." For a moment, I thought he might say something more. Instead, he whispered, "Good night." The following week, Sophie stayed with me for 2 days while Ethan traveled for work. When he arrived to pick her up, I immediately noticed something. He smelled faintly of alcohol. Not strongly, but enough. Ethan rarely drank. Daniel had taught him to be careful because alcoholism ran in our family. As Sophie went upstairs to collect her backpack, I looked at him. "Have you been drinking?" He avoided my eyes. "A little." "How much is a little?" He sighed. "Mom." I remained quiet. Finally, he said, "Sometimes it helps me sleep." My heart tightened, because grief often introduces itself quietly, not through tears, through habits, through exhaustion, through the need to stop feeling for a few hours. That evening, I sat in my living room, unable to relax. I remembered Daniel's younger brother. Alcohol had slowly taken him away from everyone who loved him. Not because he was weak, because pain became easier to numb than to face. The next afternoon, Sophie called. Her voice trembled. "Grandma?" "What happened?" "Daddy yelled." I stood immediately. "At you?" She hesitated. "Yeah." My stomach dropped. "What happened?" "I spilled juice." There was silence. "He said he was sorry afterward." I sat down slowly. "Are you okay?" She sniffled. "He cried." That hurt even more, because Ethan had become the kind of father he once promised never to become. Not cruel, not abusive, simply overwhelmed. And overwhelmed people often hurt the people they love most. 2 days later, Ethan came to my house unexpectedly. His eyes looked red. He sat at the kitchen table and stared into his coffee. Finally, he said, "I yelled at Sophie." I nodded. "She told me." He covered his face with his hands. "I've never done that before." "No?" His voice broke. "My father never yelled." I looked at Daniel's photograph. "Your father had difficult days, too." But he didn't become this. I wanted to tell him that Daniel had also struggled, that grief changes people, that fear changes people. But Ethan wasn't asking for answers. He was asking for forgiveness. And perhaps forgiveness is something we must first learn to give ourselves. "I scared her." I reached across the table. For the first time in months, I touched my son's hand. Then apologize. I did. Again. He looked up, and then change. Tears filled his eyes. I don't know how. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I said quietly, "You ask for help." He laughed bitterly. I pushed everyone away. I thought about those words, because they were true. Madison had left. His friends rarely called. His work was failing, and he had pushed away his mother. Only Sophie remained. Only Sophie still believed completely. Several days later, Sophie came to my house after school. She seemed unusually quiet. While we baked cookies, she suddenly asked, "Grandma." "Yes." "What if Daddy stops loving me?" The spoon fell from my hand. "Why would you ask that?" She stared at the table. "He gets angry now." I sat beside her. "Sweetheart, your father loves you more than anything." "Then why is he sad all the time?" I didn't know how to answer. Because depression often looks like anger to children. Exhaustion looks like rejection. Pain looks like distance. "He isn't angry at you." She nodded slowly. "I still love him." My throat tightened. I know, even now, after the yelling, after the tears, after the loneliness, she still loved him, unconditionally. One Friday evening, I received a call from Ethan. It was nearly midnight. His voice sounded unsteady. "Mom." "What's wrong?" "I can't do this." My heart began racing. "Where's Sophie?" "Sleeping." "Have you been drinking?" Silence. That answer frightened me. "I only had a few." "Ethan," he laughed, "I lost another client." I sat on the edge of my bed. And I don't know who I am anymore. For a moment, I heard the frightened 14-year-old boy who had lost his father, not the businessman, not the husband, just my son. "I thought I was successful." "You are." "No." His voice cracked. "Mom, I ruined everything." I wanted to drive to him, to rescue him, to protect him. But I remembered what Dr. Singh had said. Reduce stress. Take care of yourself. And I remembered something else. My son was no longer a boy. "I need you to pour out the alcohol." Silence. "Ethan." Several moments passed. Then I heard liquid hitting a sink. Afterward, he cried. Not loudly, quietly. Like a man whose entire life had finally become too heavy. The next morning, Sophie arrived. She looked worried. Daddy slept on the couch. Did he seem okay? He hugged me. I smiled softly. That's good. He said I was the best thing in his life. My heart hurt, because children should never become responsible for keeping adults alive emotionally. Yet Sophie had become exactly that. One Sunday afternoon, while we sat beneath the lemon tree, she looked up at me. If something happened to me, Daddy would be alone. The words froze my blood. What do you mean? She shrugged. He doesn't have anybody. I pulled her close. He has you. She looked down. And you. Tears filled my eyes. Because she was right. Despite everything, Ethan still had two people who loved him completely. His daughter. His mother. But he had spent months believing he had lost one, and he had placed the weight of his entire heart upon the other. That frightened me. More than the drinking, more than the sadness, more than the loneliness. Because people who build their entire world around one person often do not survive losing them. As Sophie left that evening, she hugged me tightly. I'll see you next week. Of course. She smiled. Then she ran toward Ethan's car. He stood beside the driver's door watching her. For a brief moment, he smiled. A real smile. The first one I had seen in months, and I realized something painful. Sophie was keeping him alive. Her laughter, her forgiveness, her faith. She still believed her father could become himself again. But life is fragile, and none of us knew that one rainy evening was approaching, an evening that would change everything forever. The night Sophie disappeared, it was raining. Rain in Arizona is strange. It arrives suddenly, violently, as if the sky has waited too long to cry. That afternoon, my chest had been hurting again. Dr. Singh had increased my medication, and I spent most of the day resting in my living room. Around 6 o'clock, Sophie called. Her voice sounded quiet. "Grandma?" "Hi, sweetheart." "What are you doing?" "Reading." She hesitated. "I wish I was there." My heart tightened. Did something happen? No. Children often say no when the answer is yes. "How's your father?" She became silent. "He's sad." "Did you eat dinner?" "I don't know." "You don't know." Daddy forgot. I closed my eyes. Ethan forgot dinner. He was sleeping on the couch. There was something in her voice that frightened me. Loneliness. A child trying to protect an adult. "Do you want me to call him?" "No." "Why?" "He gets upset when people worry." The irony hurt, because that sentence sounded exactly like Ethan, exactly like me, exactly like every person who spends years pretending they are fine. Before hanging up, Sophie said, "I love you, Grandma." "I love you too." "And I love Daddy." My throat tightened. "I know." Those were the last words she ever said to me. Around 8 o'clock, the rain became heavier. Thunder rolled across the desert. I made tea and sat beside the window. Something felt wrong. Mothers often know these things. Grandmothers do too. At 8:47, my phone rang. "Ethan." His voice was panicked. "Mom!" My heart immediately began racing. "What happened?" "Sophie's gone." The room spun. "What?" "She left." I stood up. "What do you mean she left?" He was breathing heavily. "We argued." Fear shot through my body. "What happened?" I yelled at her. The words came out broken. "About what?" "I don't even know." I grabbed my keys. "Where are you?" "Home." "I'm coming." The drive felt endless. Rain pounded against my windshield. When I arrived, Ethan stood outside barefoot, completely soaked. His face looked terrified. "Sophie left 20 minutes ago." "Did you call the police?" "Yes." "What happened?" He covered his face. "I lost another client today." His voice shook. "I had been drinking." My stomach dropped. "Sophie asked if I was okay." He began crying. "I told her to stop treating me like I was broken." I stared at him. He continued. "She said she loved me." His voice collapsed. "And I told her to leave me alone." The words hung between us, deadly. I didn't mean it. I couldn't speak, because parents often say terrible things they do not mean. But children hear every word as truth. Police officers arrived. Flashlights moved through the rain. Neighbors searched. Everyone called Sophie's phone. No answer. Hours passed. Every minute felt unbearable. At midnight, Ethan sat in the kitchen. His hands were shaking. "I did this." "No." He looked at me. "I told her to leave me alone." His voice broke. "She's 11. For the first time in many years, I saw my son exactly as he had been after Daniel died. Terrified, small, completely lost. At 1:30 in the morning, my phone rang. The hospital. There had been an accident, a young girl. She carried identification. I don't remember the drive. I only remember Ethan screaming. I remember rain, sirens, the emergency room, and a doctor walking toward us. Sophie's backpack had been found near an intersection. A driver had not seen her crossing the street. She had been trying to walk to my house. The words shattered me. She had been coming to me, even in the rain, even in the darkness. She had been looking for safety. The doctor spoke carefully. "She's in surgery." Ethan collapsed into a chair. I sat beside him. Neither of us could breathe. Hours passed. Machines beeped. Nurses walked quietly through the halls. Families cried behind closed doors. And for the first time since Daniel died, I felt completely helpless. Around 4 a.m, Ethan finally spoke. I told her to leave me alone. I took his hand. He was trembling. "She loved you." His eyes filled with tears. "I know." "No." I looked directly at him. "She adored you." He covered his face. "I don't deserve that." The words frightened me, because grief had already begun before loss had even arrived. At 5:30, the surgeon entered the waiting room. His face told us everything. Even before he spoke, he sat beside us. There was severe trauma. Ethan stopped breathing. "We've done everything we can." My heart shattered. "But her condition is critical." Critical. Such a small word. Such enormous pain. We were allowed to see her. Sophie's body looked impossibly small in the hospital bed. Machines surrounded her. Bandages covered her head. Her hand felt cold. I sat beside her. "Ethan?" He couldn't move. "Come here." Slowly, he approached. He took her hand. His entire body began shaking. "I'm sorry." His voice barely existed. "Daddy's sorry." Tears ran down his face. "I didn't mean it." The monitors continued their steady rhythm. He leaned forward. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me." For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Ethan whispered, "Please don't leave me." The words broke something inside me, because suddenly I understood. The title of his life had changed. For months, he thought I had been holding him back. But now, he realized something far worse. He had been pushing away the very people who loved him. And sitting in that hospital room connected to machines was the one person who had never stopped believing in him. Sophie had loved him when his wife left. She loved him when he failed. She loved him when he drank. She loved him when he yelled. She loved him when he forgot dinner. She loved him when he forgot himself. She had become the last person standing beside him. The last unconditional love. Hours later, as the sun began rising outside the hospital windows, my own chest began hurting. Severely. I gripped the chair. A nurse approached. "Ma'am?" I shook my head. Not now. Nothing mattered except Sophie. Ethan looked at me. "Mom?" "I'm fine." The lie tasted familiar. Doctors moved in and out. Time stopped existing. Every minute became an eternity. Finally, shortly after sunrise, a nurse entered quietly. Her eyes were filled with sadness. And in that moment, before she spoke a single word, my son understood. His face changed. He stood up. "No." The nurse began crying. And Ethan, my son, the man who once believed I had been holding him back, fell to his knees beside his daughter's bed. Because the only person who had continued loving him without conditions was slipping away, and he could do absolutely nothing to stop it. Sophie died at 8:17 that morning. For a long time, I believed there would be music, or light, or some kind of sign that a soul had left the world. There wasn't. There was only silence. The monitor stopped. The nurse lowered her eyes, and my son made a sound I had never heard before. Not when Daniel died, not when Madison left, not even when he told me I had been holding him back. This sound came from somewhere deeper. It was the sound of a father losing his child. Ethan. He fell beside Sophie's bed. No. His voice cracked. No, sweetheart. He held her hand. He begged. He apologized. He repeated her name over and over again. But death does not negotiate. I stood beside him, my own chest burning. For a moment, I thought I might collapse. The nurse asked whether I needed help. I shook my head. Nothing mattered. Only Sophie. Only the little girl who had loved all of us. Hours passed. Doctors completed paperwork. Nurses removed machines. The world continued moving while ours had stopped. Ethan never left her side. At one point, he looked at me. His face had changed. Years seemed to have passed overnight. I told her to leave me alone. His voice barely existed. I sat beside him. She knew you loved her. He shook his head. No. Tears ran down his face. The last thing she heard was me yelling. I had no answer. Because sometimes grief gives us questions that cannot be fixed. The funeral arrangements began 2 days later. Madison returned immediately. When she entered the funeral home, she looked completely shattered. The woman who had once spoken about expensive neighborhoods and luxury vacations now looked like every grieving mother. She approached Ethan. He did not move. She touched his arm. Ethan? He looked at her. There was no anger, no blame, only emptiness. Our daughter is gone. Madison began crying. I know. For the first time, all the arguments disappeared. Money disappeared. Pride disappeared. Everything disappeared. Only loss remained. That evening, Madison came to my house. She sat quietly at my kitchen table. Neither of us had ever been close, yet grief creates strange relationships. She looked at me. I failed her. I stared down at my coffee. We all think that. She shook her head. I spent years worrying about things that don't matter. I said nothing, because there was nothing left to prove. No victory, no blame. Only a child who would never come home. The following afternoon, Ethan arrived carrying a small box. He sat beside me. I found this. Inside was Sophie's journal. My hands began shaking. There were drawings, school notes, photographs, small pieces of an 11-year-old life. And near the back, folded carefully between the pages, was a letter. On the front, she had written, "For Daddy." Ethan could not open it. His hands trembled. Mom? I took the paper. My own vision blurred. The handwriting was uneven, childlike. Dear Daddy, if you are reading this, it means you are very sad. Please don't be sad forever. I know sometimes you think you're not a good dad, but you are. You used to make pancakes. You used to laugh. You used to tell me Grandpa would be proud of us. I think Grandpa is still proud. Grandma says people get lost sometimes. I think you're lost. But I know you'll come back. Please don't be mad at yourself. And please take care of Grandma because she loves you even when you think nobody does. I love you even when you're sad. I love you when you yell. I love you when you forget things. I love you because you're my dad. Love, Sophie. By the time I finished reading, Ethan was crying. Not quietly. Not like before. He buried his face in his hands. I don't deserve her. I sat beside him. No parent deserves a child's love. He looked at me. What does that mean? It means it's a gift. He stared at Sophie's letter. She still loved me. Yes, after everything. Yes. His voice broke. I was the one who failed her. I took his hand. No, but you were broken. He shook his head. I blamed you. The room became silent. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then he whispered, I spent years believing you were holding me back. Tears filled my eyes. And now, he looked down at the letter. I was the one letting go of the people who loved me. Those words hurt, not because they were cruel, because they were true. The funeral took place 3 days later. The church overflowed. Teachers, neighbors, friends, classmates. Everyone loved Sophie. Her favorite drawings sat beside the altar. Photographs showed her smiling, laughing, holding my hand, holding Ethan's, holding both. When it was time to speak, Ethan walked to the front. His hands shook. For several moments, he couldn't talk. Finally, he said, My daughter believed in me when I stopped believing in myself. The church became silent. I thought success mattered. He looked toward the casket. I thought money mattered. His voice broke. I thought being strong meant handling everything alone. He wiped his eyes. But the person who loved me most was an 11-year-old little girl who never asked me to be perfect. Many people cried, including me. After the service, Ethan remained beside Sophie's grave. Rain clouds gathered overhead. He spoke quietly. I pushed Mom away. He looked at me. I lost Madison. He looked back toward the flowers. And Sophie still stayed. My chest hurt again. Not physically, emotionally, because finally my son understood. The person who loved him without conditions, without expectations, without disappointment, had been his daughter. She loved him when he failed, when he drank, when he yelled, when he forgot himself. She stayed. And now she was gone. That night, Ethan came to my house. He sat in Daniel's old chair, the same chair where his father used to read newspapers. He looked around the room. I don't know who I am now. I sat beside him. Neither did I after your father died. He looked at me. How did you survive? I thought about Daniel, about years of grief, about loneliness, about love. Finally, I answered, one day at a time. He nodded. Then very quietly, he said the words I had waited months to hear. I'm sorry, Mom. I looked at him. For what? He began crying again. For making you feel unwanted. My eyes filled. For blaming you. He could barely speak. "For saying you held me back." Silence filled the room. Then he whispered, "You were the only person who never left." And for the first time since that terrible dinner, my son finally understood. He had not lost me. He had pushed me away, and the little girl who tried to bring us back together had loved him until her final breath. Sophie's last gift was not her letter. It was the truth. The truth that love had been beside him all along. And he had almost lost all of it. The first few weeks after Sophie's funeral felt unreal. People brought food, neighbors sent flowers, cards arrived in the mail. Everyone said the same things. She was so special. She was such a light. I'm so sorry. And then slowly people returned to their own lives. But grief does not. It stays. It sits quietly in empty bedrooms. It waits beside untouched backpacks. It lives inside silence. Ethan stopped working. For nearly a month, he barely left his house. Madison visited occasionally. Sometimes she stayed for dinner. Sometimes she cried beside Sophie's bed. But the marriage itself had become impossible to understand. They were two parents sharing the same grief while standing miles apart emotionally. One afternoon, I drove to Ethan's house. The lawn had become overgrown. Mail sat near the front door. The curtains remained closed. When he opened the door, my heart nearly broke. He had lost weight. His beard had grown. His eyes looked hollow. "Mom." I stepped inside. The house felt frozen. Sophie's backpack still sat beside the stairs. Her shoes remained near the front door. A drawing she had made still hung on the refrigerator. Nobody had touched anything. Ethan sat on the couch. "I don't know what to do." I looked around the room. "Neither did I after your father died." He stared at the floor. "It's my fault." The sentence had become part of him. Every day, every hour. His punishment. "No." He looked up. "I told her to leave me alone." "You were hurting." "I was drunk." "You were grieving before you knew you were grieving." He shook his head. "She was trying to help me." I sat beside him. "She loved you." His voice cracked. "And I failed her." For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I never expected. "I understand now." I looked at him. "What?" He stared at his hands. "How lonely you were after Dad died." Tears filled my eyes. Because for 20 years, I had tried to explain that loneliness, and only loss had taught him. When Sophie died, he whispered, the entire world disappeared. I nodded slowly. "Yes." "And you lived like that?" "Yes." His voice trembled. "Alone." I looked toward the window. "I had you." He began crying, "And I pushed you away." The truth had finally arrived. Not through arguments, not through lectures, through pain. Several days later, Ethan asked if he could visit me regularly. Not because he needed money, not because he needed childcare, not because he needed something fixed. He simply wanted to sit. Sometimes we drank coffee. Sometimes we looked through old family photographs. Sometimes we talked about Daniel. Sometimes we talked about Sophie. One afternoon, we opened Sophie's journal again. Inside, we found another drawing. 3 people standing beneath a tree. Sophie, Ethan, me. Above us, she had written, "My family." There was no Madison, no large house, no expensive things, only love. Ethan stared at the drawing for a long time. She knew. What mattered? I nodded. Children usually do. Several weeks later, my own health worsened. I collapsed in my kitchen while making tea. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. For a moment, I became frightened. Not because of the doctors, because I was alone. Then I heard a voice. "Mom!" Ethan sat beside me. He looked exhausted, terrified. "When did you get here?" "As soon as they called." I looked around. "How long?" 6 hours. My eyes filled. "You stayed?" His voice broke. "Of course I stayed." The room became quiet. Then he whispered, "I should have stayed before." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he took my hand, the same way Sophie once held mine. "I'm sorry I made you feel like a burden." Tears ran down my face. "You weren't a burden. I made you believe you were." He looked down. "I spent years blaming you because I didn't know how to blame myself." Those words hurt, but they healed too, because honesty often arrives late, yet it still matters. The doctors eventually explained that my heart condition had progressed. Treatment would help. Rest would help. Stress would help. But age changes certain things. When we left the hospital, Ethan drove me home. At a stoplight, he suddenly said, "Sophie saved me." I looked at him. Yes. She never stopped loving me. No. His eyes filled. Even when I didn't deserve it. I thought about that. Then I answered, "Children don't love because we deserve it." He nodded. "They love because they're children." Months passed. Winter arrived. The holidays became unbearable. Thanksgiving felt empty. Christmas felt impossible. Sophie's stocking remained in its box. Nobody knew what to do. On Christmas Eve, Ethan came to my house. He carried a small package. "What's this?" He smiled sadly. "Open it." Inside was a framed photograph. It showed Sophie standing between us beneath my lemon tree. She was laughing. One hand held mine. The other held Ethan's. On the back, he had written, "She brought us home." I cried, because it was true. The little girl who died walking toward my house had somehow rebuilt our family. Not through words, through love. A few days later, Ethan visited Sophie's grave. For the first time, he asked me to come with him. We stood together in silence. The winter wind moved through the cemetery. He knelt beside the stone. "I miss you." His voice trembled. "I still hear you." He looked at me. "I think she saved my life." I nodded. "She did." He took a long breath. "Mom." "Yes." "Do you think she forgives me?" I looked toward the small flowers lying beside the grave. I remembered Sophie's letter. I remembered her words. "I love you when you yell. I love you when you forget things. I love you because you're my dad." I touched my son's shoulder. "She forgave you before you even asked." He cried then, not like the father who had lost everything. Not like the man drowning in guilt, but like the little boy who once lost his father. The boy who finally understood that love had never been holding him back. Love had been holding him up. And the two people who loved him most, his mother and his daughter, had never stopped believing he could come home. The first spring after Sophie died, the lemon tree in my backyard bloomed earlier than usual. I stood at my kitchen window one morning, looking at the tiny white flowers, and for the first time in months, I didn't immediately feel pain. I felt memory. I heard Sophie's laugh. I saw her small hands helping me water the garden. I remembered her sitting beneath that tree, telling me she would live next door to me someday. Grief never disappears. It simply changes shape. 3 months after the funeral, Ethan called me. "Mom." "Yes." "I started seeing a therapist." I closed my eyes. For a long moment I couldn't speak. Because in my family, people didn't talk about therapy. We talked about hard work, prayer, endurance, but not healing. "I'm proud of you," I finally said. He was quiet. "I don't want to become the man I was." Those words mattered. Because true change begins when someone stops defending their mistakes. Over the following months, Ethan slowly rebuilt his life. Not the life he had imagined. A different one. He sold the large house. He moved into a smaller townhouse near a public park that Sophie had loved. He stopped drinking. He returned to work, but this time he accepted fewer clients. He no longer chased every dollar. He no longer worked until midnight. Some weekends, he simply sat on a bench and watched children play. One Saturday, he invited me to join him. We sat beneath a large oak tree. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then he said, "I used to think success would make me happy." I smiled sadly. "What do you think now?" He looked toward the playground. "I think peace is more important." The answer sounded older than his years. Pain often does that. Several months later, Ethan asked if I would come with him somewhere. He drove us to an elementary school. At first, I didn't understand. Then he handed me a folder. Inside were documents. "What is this?" He smiled softly. "The Sophie Cruz Memorial Scholarship." I stared at him. Every year, the scholarship would help one child whose family struggled financially. Children who loved reading. Children who showed kindness to others. Children like Sophie. Tears filled my eyes. "You did this." He nodded. "I wanted her name to keep helping people." For several moments, I couldn't speak, because this was not the same man who once believed love had held him back. This was a man finally learning what love was for. A few weeks later, he came to my house carrying a toolbox. "What are you doing?" He smiled. "Fixing your fence." "You don't have to." "I know." I laughed softly. That sentence alone told me how much he had changed. He repaired the fence. Then he fixed the kitchen faucet. Then he cleaned my gutters. Never because I asked. Never because he felt guilty. Simply because he wanted to care for me. One afternoon, while drinking coffee on the porch, he said, "I spent years thinking you needed me." I looked at him. "You never did." I smiled. "I needed your love." He nodded slowly. "But not your rescue." "No." He looked down. I didn't understand the difference. Neither had I. For years, I had made myself useful because usefulness felt like love. I had believed that if I gave enough, sacrificed enough, helped enough, I would never be left behind. Losing Sophie taught me something different. Love cannot be earned through suffering. Love cannot survive without respect. And mothers are human beings too. That summer, my health improved. The medication helped. So did peace. Stress had been slowly breaking my heart long before doctors discovered the problem. One evening, Ethan came over for dinner. After we ate, we sat beneath the lemon tree. The sky turned pink and gold. He looked toward the branches. This was her favorite spot. Yes. He swallowed hard. I still talk to her. I smiled. So do I. He looked surprised. You do. Every day. He laughed softly. What do you say? I thought about it. Mostly that I miss her. He nodded. Me too. Several moments passed. Then he asked, Do you think she'd be proud of me? I looked at my son, at the lines grief had placed around his eyes, at the humility pain had given him, at the man sitting beside me. Yes. He became emotional. Really? I nodded. Because you're trying. His eyes filled with tears. She always believed I could be better. She did. He smiled sadly. She was smarter than I was. We both laughed. The first real laugh we had shared in almost 2 years. Then he said something I will never forget. I thought you were holding me back. I looked at him. But all you ever did was hold me up. Tears immediately filled my eyes, because sometimes the words we need most arrive very late, but they still heal. A few weeks before Sophie's birthday, Ethan came to my house carrying a small box. Inside were 3 butterfly-shaped garden stones. One read daughter, one read granddaughter. The last one read, Love never leaves. Together we placed them beneath the lemon tree. Then we sat there until sunset. No speeches, no dramatic promises, just peace. Eventually, Ethan looked at me. Thank you. For what? For not giving up on me. I thought about that. The truth was, there had been moments when I wanted to. Moments when I was too hurt, too tired, too broken. But motherhood is complicated. You can step away. You can create boundaries. You can protect your heart. Yet some part of you never stops loving your child. I never gave up. I said softly. I just stopped carrying things that weren't mine. He nodded slowly. I understand that now. And I believe he did. The following spring, on Sophie's birthday, we held a small gathering at the park she loved. Children received books. The first scholarship recipient gave a short speech, and for the first time since losing her, I felt something other than grief. Purpose. Sophie's love had not ended. It had simply changed form. As the sun began setting, Ethan stood beside me. You know, he said, I still miss her every single day. I do too. But I don't feel lost anymore. I smiled. Neither do I. We looked toward the sky. Somewhere above us, birds crossed the evening light. And I thought about everything that had happened. A son who blamed his mother. A granddaughter who loved without conditions. A family that broke apart. A tragedy that changed everything. In the end, my son did lose the only person who loved him without limits. But because of her, he found something else. Humility, gratitude, and his way back home. As for me, I finally understood something that took 62 years to learn. Love should lift people, not consume them. And the people who truly love us are never the ones holding us back. They're the ones quietly holding us together.